to you a little bit about glazing today. Now, you glazed pots in Art 1, obviously, and you learned some basics of glazing, but things get a little bit more complicated in intermediate art and as you progress forward. So I wanted to cover a few different things. First of all, and this is important to know, glaze contains 5 different things in order to create the surface that we see after we've glazed our pieces. The first is silica, which actually is the component that melts down and creates this glass look that we see on our glazes. The next is clay. There are little tiny particles of clay that allow the glaze to actually adhere to our clay body. The third is flux, and what flux does is that it allows the clay particles and the silica to mix and blend together really well. The fourth is colorant, and that is what determines whether you have a green glaze once it's fired or a red glaze once it's fired. It determines the color. A lot of times colorants can come from the earth and be more natural, or they can also be manufactured. Most of the glazes we use are manufactured colorants. The fifth thing that you'll find in glaze is water, and that is simply just what makes it liquid form and allows it to stick to our clay body and also allows us to brush it on or dip it. So you have your vessel and it's ready to be glazed. It's come out of the kiln the first time. We call this a bisqueware. It's called that because it's hard as a biscuit. It has been fired one time. It's very, it pings when you snap at it, and it's very porous, which we'll cover in a little bit why that's important to know. Once you get it out of the kiln, if you want to sand down some rough parts of it, you certainly can. You can use some sandpaper to sand some of the edges. Hopefully you've done most of your smoothing though before it got fired. If you do need sandpaper, it's located right over here with the tools. Once you get all it sanded and everything, you can use a damp sponge and some water like this to make sure you get all of that clay dust that you've put on there off. This is also a good time, like I have some splatters on here and some other types of dust. It's a very dusty room that I want to get off. You don't want to run your pot under running water. The reason is because our clay body at this point, as a bisque piece, is very porous. If you were to take a magnifying glass up to it, it would look like a dried out sponge. That is good because it actually is what helps the glaze adhere to our pot when we're brushing or dipping. What we don't want to do though is we don't want to saturate it with water and then try to glaze it. What ends up happening is that there's already too much moisture in there and the glaze will not stick to it. In fact, that's something that happened to this one right here. You can see this is a coil piece that somebody created where there's the glaze isn't sticking in some parts to the clay body. It was probably wet, or there could have been a variety of other things wrong with it. The other thing is that if something has already been glazed once, for example, this piece is a glazed piece, I can't brush glaze on it and try to fire it again because this glaze creates an airtight seal over those tiny little pores that we see. And so if I tried to brush glaze on, it would just crawl away. It would repel it, basically, and it wouldn't adhere. Let's talk a little bit about the types of firing. So your pieces have all been through a bisque firing. Both high fire clay and low fire clay is fired at cone 04 in this class. That means we're firing it in our kiln at about 1900 degrees. Now, for the glaze firing, it's different. When we use raku glazes, we fire it differently for the glaze process as we do for low fire and again for high fire. Our low fire glazes, which is what you used in Art 1, and you'll use some of that in here, they only fire at about 1900 degrees. They fire at cone 05 when they are fired for their glaze firing. It's just a little bit over cone 04. A little bit under cone 04. Our high fire glazes are fired at cone 5. So if you think of 0 as being here, below it is 0, 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. But then above it are the whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cone 5 is over 2100 degrees. Cone 04 is around 1900 degrees. So it's the scale of cones and different temperatures that you can fire things. What else you can do? If you're going to be dipping your pieces for glazing, okay? Up until this point, you've only ever brushed glaze on, but this semester, we will be dipping our piece in glaze for some of our pieces, especially the raku pieces. Something you need to do is you need to make sure that you keep the bottom of your pieces free of glaze. And usually, if we're brushing glaze on, we can put our piece on one of these turning wheels and use a brush, and we can make sure that we don't get glaze on the bottom of the piece. Remember, if there's glaze on the bottom of your piece, it will actually stick to the kiln shelf and will probably break when we try to take it off. If you're dipping a piece, you're submerging it into the glaze. So we have what we call a wax resist right here that we use. It's in liquid form, and I have makeup sponges. What you will do is you'll actually use a makeup sponge, and I like these better than brushes because you have a little bit more control over it. You want to make sure that you don't get this anywhere else besides on the foot of your piece. And you can just go around the edge to make sure that you have a nice straight line on the bottom of your piece. Once you have the wax resist on, you can then submerge your piece into the glaze, and the wax will actually keep the glaze from sticking to the parts where you have the wax resist on. Also, when you're dipping your piece into glaze, we have these special tongs which grip onto our clay vessel and allow us to submerge it into the glaze with minimal touches to the piece, so that when we actually take these off, we can just touch up the tiny little points where the tongs were touched. You might remember this from before, but whenever you're brushing glazes on, we use these special bamboo brushes. I've got different sizes depending on what kind of piece you're doing, but they're nice because they're big and flat, and they allow you to coat your piece very evenly. I also recommend a wheel so that you're turning your piece and getting your glaze on there as evenly as possible. You want to do 2 to 3 coats of glaze on your piece and make sure you get every nook and cranny. The 2 to 3 kind of depends on how thick the glaze is when you get to it. You want to make sure whatever glaze you're using that you mix it up really well before you use it, because all those things like the clay particles and the silica all settle down at the bottom. And that's where all the good stuff is, all your colorants and everything that you want in your glaze. So you need to make sure it's well mixed beforehand. Here are 2 examples of pieces that have been dip glazed. Now, dipping your piece in glaze is relatively easy. You only have to dip it once, usually. Here's an example where they dipped it in red, and then they actually took the rim and just dipped the rim in this blue to allow it to drip around the edges. Here's an example where they actually dipped one side in this white glaze, the other side in the red, and then they also dipped the rim in this blue-black to get this. Just a reminder of where our glazes are. Up here are all of our low fire glazes. See the pink dot on the sign? That is an indicator to let you know that the pink dot glazes are all low fire. So those are all over here on the shelves that also have the pink dot and say low fire glaze. It is really important that you put the glaze back on a shelf that's appropriate to the dot that it matches. Down here we have underglazes. Underglazes we're going to be using for our sgraffito pieces and other times when you might want to paint details onto a piece. Since regular glazes are not good for detail work, we use underglaze. Notice the underglaze has a yellow dot, and the underglazes are all located over here, again with yellow dots. For underglazes, if you're doing some really small details and painting almost like a picture, you can use regular paint brushes for that as well. The third type of glaze that we have in our classroom at all times are the high fire glazes. These have a blue dot. Our high fire glazes are what we use for our food safe pieces, our thrown pieces, and they also just offer more variations. Our high fire glazes are all on the top shelves over here, and again the lids all have blue dots on them.